We are the sum total of our experiences. Those experiences, be they positive or negative, make us the person we are at any given point in our lives. And like a flowing river, those same experiences and those yet to come continue to influence and reshape the person we are and the person we become. None of us are the same as we were yesterday, nor will we be tomorrow. I want you to think about your experiences and the journey that you're on right now. What did you want to be when you grew up? Where is the course that you're on taking you? At what points have you felt like you were surviving? And when did you really feel like you were thriving? I'm Courtney Robertson, web designer and developer advocate at GoDaddy Pro and co-rep of the WordPress training team. I'd like to share with you what it's like to go from surviving to thriving as a mom in tech. I first discovered that I was interested in technology while I was still in grade school. My mom was a high school business education teacher. She taught typing. I happened to have technology around available in my home. I was that kid that took on all the extra projects when I was in grade school and learned to use PageMaker and computers with mice well before my school had those options available to me. As I progressed through high school, I realized that I wanted to go into teaching, and so my upper high school courses dealt specifically with a lot more technology and technology education training. Eventually, I would go on to college, and in college, my first introduction to computer programming, where I decided I loved to work, wasn't a good environment. I had a dim projector in 1999 in a room where only the teacher had a computer, and the sun was setting. I learned to code on paper and pencil. I was fortunate enough to have a friend that lent me a laptop so that I could even survive in that class. We had put open source Red Hat Linux on it, stripped it down to just a command line interface, and I learned all about how to get floppy disks read by that interface and then walking over to the network, where I could then upload my floppy disk files to the server and remote compile those things. I would not describe that experience as thriving. It really was just barely surviving. And a few of my other college classes were about on par with that. But I found that I loved working with technology and helping train students in that throughout my student teaching experience. So on some levels, I was thriving because it was what I loved to do. But the circumstances and situations were just barely getting by. Around the time I was getting out of college, I realized that what I wanted to do with my life was to help raise the standard of living for people across the globe. And in doing so, I saw technology as the way to achieve that. I wasn't real clear at that time on the vision or how that would play out, but I knew that I wanted others to have a better experience and more opportunity that I had. When I began teaching, I was in a fairly old school district, a fairly old building. I was provided a cart and an overhead projector. My job was to teach 11th graders how to get ready for jobs themselves, resumes, cover letters, job interview skills. These were all initiatives in the state of Pennsylvania and new standards in terms of education that grade level would need to meet upon completing school. There were no textbooks for this at the time. There were no resources or materials, and I was a rookie teacher. While both of my parents may have been school teachers, I was completely out of my element. I was expected to help with their graduation project proposals and oversee a whole district worth of staff having to participate in this. I didn't get extra time or resources available for that additional component, and so I barely survived that year. The very first year, I did not feel well. I would later find out that we had a mold issue in our building, so there was no sense of thriving there. It was a chore for me to get through that point, but I also knew that I loved working with students, and I loved helping them connect to their future and to discover and research what it is that they might be interested in doing. After those initial first 4 years, I took a position in another school district, this time instructing on high school business education. During that time, I was able to work with students in web development. I instructed on HTML and CSS, and I taught students what they needed for the Microsoft Office exams. I felt like I was surviving better there. There were still parts that were a bit of a challenge. One of them being I had no means of electronically collecting my students' work, and I needed to do so in an electronic format to assess whether they did what they should have done. Paper would not have revealed the info that I needed. So I found Moodle, which was an open source learning management system, and I was able to have students upload their assignments to that location. It certainly helped me with assessing their work. However, the school district didn't authorize it, wasn't really great with this idea, but it was my introduction to using open source in a different context, I would say, than I had previously. I also found Joomla and began blogging, and later would find WordPress, which can work as a blog, a learning management system for a whole school district, and so much more. So I began using WordPress in terms of getting resources that I needed for my class, and this would have been in the very early days, so around 2006. WordPress would have been very young at that point. I also started using it for some of my outside interests, and had a few friends that contacted me saying, so-and-so needs this thing done, and would you be interested in able to help get that done? And they're willing to pay you for this. So I began learning more web development than HTML and CSS alone that I was teaching in the schools. I had to learn a new language and understand how an entire content management system would come together. And I got hooked. After having parents that were school teachers, having nearly a decade of experience in the schools myself by this point, I decided that I was going to exit the school system. I have a lot of ideas about how education could be reformed, but I was feeling the pressure, particularly within business education, where the other school and educational standards and initiatives were overcrowding this area that was actually teaching programming and coding, what would give way to STEAM, but they were neglecting business education, feeling that it really didn't meet that area's criteria. I also really wanted to have a bit of a flexible schedule for the first time in my life. And so I decided to start pursuing work with freelance clients, and I was able to meet their needs and work with some really amazing and great people. Through that journey, I learned a lot more about WordPress, and I began even teaching others about using WordPress. In terms of professional networking and understanding, I was thriving. In terms of paying my bills, I was surviving. And it was still a great opportunity. I was able to start attending WordPress-related events. I went to my first WordCamp. While there, I was one of 4 females in a crowd of about 150 people. And at this point, most of the speakers were men. Most of the topics were things that were deeply over my head, but I still had this drive to learn. And so, though it doesn't look like necessarily I was thriving financially at that point, it was still a very pivotal point in my career. While freelancing, I would go on to meet my husband, and we were together for about 3 years before we began having a home and family and all of those things. As it would be, our family was quite a journey to be more than just the 2 of us. We would go through 3 different miscarriages. Freelancing or holding any job while going through all of those fertility struggles can be a real challenge, especially when science has no answers, the doctors had no answers. It was a real struggle for our family to go through some mental health challenges through all of those losses. Right in the middle of my 4th pregnancy, I was offered an opportunity to teach for a semester in Avotech, a career technical school. That experience was fantastic. I got to work with high school students who spent half of their day in academic classes and half of their day in a computer shop learning programming, hardware, networking, and then some. I specifically instructed on WordPress, tying together other parts of website development that they had already learned and synthesizing that into WordPress. This would have been in the very early years still of WordPress and the journey through that. By this point in time, I had discovered the WordPress training team by attending some events, and so I was able to take some of the material that I helped the WordPress training team create and apply it to teaching in the school system. That was amazing work for me. I felt for sure that I was able to help students connect to real-world job skills that they absolutely needed afterwards. I was growing more and more pregnant, and finally, we would make it past all of the dates that we had before and go on to have our son, Asher. He was born 6 weeks early, and I had a position at the time between teaching in the VOTEC and having my son. I had picked up work as a technical content writer. I was specifically writing about WordPress, but I quickly realized, especially while still in the hospital going through the NICU for 3 weeks, that I wouldn't be able to maintain this job. So I had to let that go. And for the next few months, my son was colicky. There was no way that I could work even part-time. Our journey through beginning to have children to having our firstborn was really hard. My family suffered PTSD, went through family counseling, and both of us needed to spend a good bit of time on just trying to survive at this point. As we continued, we would go on to have our second son that we get to hold. This time around was a lot different. And in between, I had picked up again some work doing technical document writing. So as we got to the point where we had our second son, we didn't experience the struggle or the strain that we had previously. And the recovery time was generally more what you would consider an average delivery. So at that point, I felt like our family began to thrive again, that we found our breath, that we were able to get some sleep as parents, that we could think about how our days would go. And it just generally felt like we were thriving together better. So as I re-entered the workforce after having my second, I found another position working in support and technical document writing again. I began handling release communications, and it was a schedule that would work for our family. I was only able to commit to about 20 hours a week. I was subcontracting with one individual and for another company writing a lot of material. In that experience, it wasn't my highest paying lifetime work. I wasn't doing completely the fulfilling work that I wanted to do, but I was enjoying what I was doing and I was helping. And most importantly, I could work during my kids' nap time. Being able to use a little bit of my brain besides mom work, which I love, but use a little bit of my professional power, was really vital to me feeling like I was contributing as well overall to our family and to society. Through that, though, I also had an opportunity to learn about the environment that I was working in. And I didn't realize the scale that would pay off for me later. So while I was not using all of my mom brain, I wasn't using all of my work brain, I wasn't bringing in a lot of money, I was still able to work within the constraints of what my family needed. And my kids were thriving. I was learning skills that I would need later. And I was able to gain a lot of experience to understand that particular niche, that area. So it was within the WordPress product space, a company that makes an addition that you add inside of WordPress and empowers a lot of businesses through that experience. I learned about the different job roles within that organization. I learned about how the owners thought about the economy, how the owners thought about running their business. I learned skills in communication, both internally, how to talk to those that have more skill than I do to get the information out of their heads and then share it with people that needed that information in a way that made sense to them. And that became external communication skills that I would go on to learn as well. So I felt overall like I was thriving in that spot. I received an offer through LinkedIn that I thought surely was too good to be true. An employer had reached out to me asking me to step back into teaching WordPress again. This time I had all of that experience freelancing, working inside a company that makes things for WordPress, subcontracting with clients that maintained lots of other websites. I had something to offer. I had to juggle between I've stayed at home with my children to now I need to have some childcare available. And how do I go about doing that? That was part of the challenge. The next part of the challenge is I hadn't learned a whole lot of new skills during those young children years in terms of actual development and code. I was learning a lot about other areas, but I needed to improve my own personal skills in code too. I began teaching, and in that experience, I was working initially with high school students again, so I felt very comfortable in my element, and I was taking students from an introduction to using the software up to creating things with it, but not yet really touching the code. During all of that, I knew that an additional adult education track would be coming that would be very code focused. So I was able to dedicate some of my day every day to continue my personal learning as I ramped up my development skills and got more familiar with what had changed during all of those young children years that I was sort of off the radar. I felt that I was thriving while I was working with my youth interns, and the adults program would come along a little bit later. And again, I felt like I was thriving. I was able to make connections again with the community, with the WordPress community, which is really key to helping people get employed. I was able to continue bringing the most current training into that experience. And best of all, the individuals I was working with were getting retrained using COVID relief funds to re-enter the job market. I loved the work that I was doing. I still, though, on some level felt like there was just a part of me that was surviving. I was still racing to try and stay adequately ahead of where I was going to be taking my students. And I wanted to make sure that there were more opportunities for these individuals as soon as they got done with this training program to get out and get to work. I would say I was between surviving and thriving at this point. I was thriving in terms of being in my element and teaching and using my full brain power again in a professional sense. I was surviving in terms of feeling that my students had adequate or enough training and resources available to them to be qualified for the positions that they would be applying for. I love my time as a bootcamp instructor, and I love working with the people that I was with. An opportunity again came along, this time as a web designer and developer advocate at GoDaddy Pro. The reason that I was open to this switch is because I felt more solidly about getting the resources and material possible through the WordPress training team. The WordPress training team helped launch learn.wordpress.org, and there you'll find training materials related to WordPress that are aimed at reducing the barriers to entry, continuing the professional ongoing learning experience that is needed in the WordPress community as well. By putting my efforts into that location, into a spot where more resources, more schools, more educational institutes, more individual learners can get to the training that they need to continue on in their career, lined up absolutely perfectly with my life work, with my vision of raising that standard of living, of empowering people through technology to do whatever it is that they want to pursue. And by working with GoDaddy Pro, it has opened up more opportunities for me to connect individuals to the resources that they need. It has opened up opportunity for my family to thrive. It has opened up more doors for my employer as well to have a space and a way to contribute into one of the things that makes this company successful, into the WordPress project. Looking at the span of your early childhood interests into the career that you ultimately are pursuing, to the work that you're currently doing now, you could see that there are times when you are surviving and times when you are really thriving. And so keep a hold of that vision, of that drive that you have, of what it is that you want to go after and what you're working for through all of this. Think about all of the resources that are available to you and pursue your goals, your dreams to the fullest of your capability. At different points, it may seem like the river of life is sort of wandering off a little bit, or that there are rapids ahead. But rest assured that you will get to the point that you're aiming for. You will get to the spot that you want. And with that, I'd like to leave you with a quote from Hal Boyle that sums up how I feel about surviving and thriving. What makes a river so restful to people is that it doesn't have any doubt. It is sure to get where it is going, and it doesn't want to go anywhere else. As you continue in your career in tech, there are going to be hurdles. There are going to be times where you survive and times where you thrive, but you are sure to get where you are going when you follow your passion.